Chapter 1 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Naval Conditions Before the War of Secession. The Officers and Seamen. Part 1. Naval officers who began their career in the '50s of the past century, as I did, and who survive till now, as very many do, have been observant, if inconspicuous, witnesses of one of the most rapid and revolutionary changes that naval science and warfare have ever undergone. It has been aptly said that a naval captain who fought the Invincible Armada would have been more at home in the typical warship of 1840 than the average captain of 1840 would have been in the advanced types of the American Civil War. The 20 years here chosen for comparison cover the middle period of the century, which has but recently expired. Since that time progress has gone on in accelerating ratio, and if the consequent changes have been less radical in kind, they have been more extensive in scope. It is interesting to observe that within the same 2 decades, in 1854, occurred the formal visit of Commodore Perry to Japan, and the negotiations of the treaty bringing her fairly within the movement of Western civilization, starting her upon the path which has resulted in the most striking illustration yet given of the powers of modern naval instruments, ships, and weapons, diligently developed and elaborated during the period that has since elapsed. When I received my appointment to the Naval School at Annapolis in the early part of the year 1856, the United States Navy was under the influence of one of those spasmodic awakenings which, so far as action is concerned, have been the chief characteristic of American statesmanship in the matter of naval policy up to 20 years ago. Since then, there has been a more continuous practical recognition of the necessity for a sustained and consistent development of naval power. This wholesome change has been coincident with, and doubtless largely due to, a change in appreciation of the importance of naval power in the realm of international relations, which within the same period has passed over the world at large. The United States of America began its career under the Constitution of 1789 with no navy, but in 1794 the intolerable outrages of the Barbary pirates, and the humiliation of having to depend upon the armed ships of Portugal for the protection of American trade, aroused Congress to vote the building of a half-dozen frigates, with the provision, however, that the building should stop if an arrangement with Algiers were reached. Not till 1798 was the Navy separated from the War Department. The President at that date, John Adams, was, through his New England origin, in profound sympathy with all naval questions, and while minister to Great Britain in 1785, had had continual opportunity to observe the beneficial effects of maritime activity and naval power upon that kingdom. He had also bitter experience of the insolence of its government toward our interests, based upon its conscious control of the sea. He thus came into office strongly biased toward naval development. To the impulse given by him contributed also the outrageous course toward our commerce initiated by the French Directory, after Bonaparte's astounding campaigns in Italy had struck down all opposition to France save that of the mistress of the seas. The nation, as represented in Congress, woke up, rubbed its eyes, and built a small number of vessels, which did exemplary service in the subsequent quasi-war with France. Provision was made for a further increase, and it is not too much to say that this beginning, if maintained, might have averted the War of 1812. But within 4 years revulsion came. Adams gave place to Jefferson and Madison, the leaders of a party which frankly and avowedly rejected a navy as an element of national strength, and saw in it only a menace to liberty. Save for the irrepressible marauding of the Barbary corsairs, and the impressment of our seamen by British ships of war, the remnant of Adams' ships would not improbably have been swept out of existence. This result was feared by naval officers of the day, and with what good reason is shown by the fact that within 6 months of the declaration of war in 1812, and when the party in control was determined that war there should be, a proposition to increase the navy received but lukewarm support from the administration, and was voted down in Congress. The government, awed by the overwhelming numbers of the British fleet, proposed to save its vessels by keeping them at home, just as a few years before it had undertaken to save its commerce by forbidding its merchant ships to go to sea. Such policy with regard to a military service means to it not sleep but death. The urgent remonstrances of 3 or 4 naval captains obtained a change of plan, and at the end of the year the President admitted that, for the very reasons advanced by them, the activity of a small squadron, skillfully directed, had ensured the safe return of much the most part of our exposed merchant shipping. It is not, however, such broad general results of sagacious management that bring conviction to nations and arouse them to action. Professionally, the cruise of Rogers's squadron, unsuccessful in outward seeming, was a much more significant event, and much more productive than the capture of the Guerrière by the Constitution. But it was this which woke up the people. The other probably would not have turned a vote in either house. As a military exploit, the frigate victory was exaggerated, and not unnaturally, but no words can exaggerate its influence upon the future of the American Navy. Here was something that men could see and understand, even though they might not correctly appreciate. Coinciding as the tidings did with the mortification of Hull's surrender at Detroit, they came at a moment which was truly psychological. Bowed down with shame at reverse where only triumph had been anticipated, the exultation over victory where disaster had been more naturally awaited produced a wild reaction. The effect was decisive. Inefficient and dilatory as was much of the subsequent administration of the Navy, there was never any further question of its continuance. And yet, from the ship which thus played the most determining part in the history of her service, it has been proposed to take her name and give it to another, of newer construction, as though with the name could go also the association. Could any other victory be Nelson's victory to Great Britain? Can calling a man George Washington help to perpetuate the services of the one Washington? The last much vaunted addition to the British fleet, the dreadnought, bears a family name extending back over 2 centuries or more. She is one of a series reasonably perpetuated, ship after ship, as son after sire, a line of succession honored in the traditions of the nation. So there were victories before the one whose revered hulk still remains a hallowed association, but her individual connection with any one event has set her apart. The name might be transferred, but with it the association cannot be transmitted. But not even the victory, with all her clinging memories, did for the British Navy what the Constitution did for the American. There was thenceforward no longer any question about votes for the Navy. Ships of the line, frigates, and sloops were ordered to be built, and the impulse thus received never wholly died out. Still, as with all motives, which in origin are emotional rather than reasoned, there was a lack of staying power. As the enthusiasm of the moment languished, there came languor of growth, or more properly of development. Continuance became routine in character, tending to reproduce contentedly the old types consecrated by the War of 1812. There was little conscious recognition of national exigencies, stimulating a demand that the Navy in types and numbers should be kept abreast of the times. In most pursuits of life American intelligence has been persistently apt and quick in search of improvement. But while such characteristics have not been absent from the naval service, they have been confined chiefly and naturally to the men engaged in the profession, and have lacked the outside support which immediately felt needs impart to movements in business or politics. Few men in civil life could have given an immediate reply to the question, why do we need a navy? Besides, although the American people are aggressive, combative, even warlike, they are the reverse of military, out of sympathy with military tone and feeling. Consequently, the appearance of professional pride, the insistence upon the absolute necessity for professional training, which in the physician, lawyer, engineer, or other civil occupation is accepted as not only becoming but conducive to uplifting the profession as a whole, is felt in the military man to be the obtrusion of an alien temperament, easily stigmatized as the arrogance of professional conceit and exclusiveness. The wise traditional jealousy of any invasion of the civil power by the military has no doubt played some part in this, but a healthy vigilance is one thing, and morbid distrust another. Morbid distrust and unreasoned prepossession were responsible for the feebleness of the Navy in 1812, and these feelings long survived. An adverse atmosphere was created, with results unfortunate to the nation, so far as the Navy was important to national welfare or national progress. Indeed, between the day of my entrance into the service, 50 years ago, and the present, nowhere is change more notable than in the matter of atmosphere, of the national attitude toward the Navy and comprehension of its office. Then it was accepted without much question as part of the necessary lumber that every adequately organized maritime state carried, along with the rest of a national establishment. Of what use it was, or might be, few cared much to inquire. There was not sufficient interest even to dispute the necessity of its existence, although it is true, as late as 1875, an old-time Jeffersonian Democrat repeated to me with conviction the master's dictum, that the Navy was a useless appendage. A statement which its work in the War of Secession, as well on the Confederate as on the Union side, might seem to have been refuted sufficiently and with abundant illustration. To such doubters before the war, there was always ready the routine reply that a navy protected commerce, and American shipping, then the second in the world, literally whitened every sea with its snowy cotton sails, a distinctive mark at that time of American merchant shipping. In my first long voyage in 1859, from Philadelphia to Brazil, it was no rare occurrence to be becalmed in the doldrums in company with 2 or 3 of these beautiful semi-clipper vessels, their low black hulls contrasting vividly with the tall pyramids of dazzling canvas which rose above them. They needed no protection then, and none foresaw that within a decade, by the operations of a few small steam cruisers, they would be swept from the seas, never to return. Everything was taken for granted, and not least that the war was a barbarism of the past. From 1815 to 1850, the lifetime of a generation, international peace had prevailed substantially unbroken, despite numerous revolutionary movements internal to the states concerned, and it had been lightly assumed that these conditions would thenceforth continue, crowned as they had been by the great sacrament of peace, when the nations for the first time gathered under a common roof the fruits of their several industries in the World's Exposition of 1851. The shadows of disunion were indeed gathering over our own land, but for the most of us they carried with them no fear of war. American fight American? Never. Separation there might be, and with a common sorrow officers of both sections thought of it. But brother shed the blood of brother? No. By 1859 the Crimean War had indeed intervened to shake these fond convictions, but after all, rules have exceptions, and in the succeeding peace the British government, consistent with the prepossessions derived from the propaganda of Cobden, yielded perfectly gratuitously the principle that an enemy's commerce might be freely transported under a neutral flag, thereby wrenching away permanently one of the prongs of Neptune's trident. Surely we were on the road to universal peace. San Francisco before and after its recent earthquake, at this moment of writing 10 days ago, scarcely presented a greater contrast of experience than that my day has known; and the political condition and balance of the world now is as different from that of the period of which I have been writing as the new city will be from the old one it will replace at the Golden Gate. Of this universal change and displacement the most significant factor, at least in our Western civilization, has been the establishment of the German Empire, with its ensuing commercial, maritime, and naval development. To it, certainly, we owe the military impulse which has been transmitted everywhere to the forces of sea and land, an impulse for which, in my judgment, too great gratitude cannot be felt. It has braced and organized Western civilization for an ordeal as yet dimly perceived. But between 1850 and 1860, long desuetude of war, and confident reliance upon the commercial progress which freedom of trade had brought in its train, especially to Great Britain, had induced the prevalent feeling that tomorrow would be as today, and much more abundant. This was too consonant to national temperament not to pervade America also, and it was promoted by a distance from Europe and her complications much greater than now exists, and by the consistent determination not to be implicated in her concerns. All these factors went to constitute the atmosphere of indifference to military affairs in general, and particularly to those external interests of which a navy is the outward and visible sign and champion. I do not think there is error or exaggeration in this picture of the environment of the navy and popular appreciation at the time I entered. Under such conditions, which had obtained substantially since soon after the War of 1812, and which long disastrously affected even Great Britain, with all her proud naval traditions and maritime and colonial interests, a military service cannot thrive. Indifference and neglect tell on most individuals, and on all professions. The saving clauses were the high sense of duty and professional integrity, which from first to last I have never known wanting in the service; while the beauty of the ships themselves, quick as a docile and intelligent animal to respond to the master's call, inspired affection and intensified professional enthusiasm. The exercises of sails and spars, under the varying exigencies of service, bewildering as they may have seemed to the uninitiated, to the appreciative, possessed fascination, and were their own sufficient reward for the care lavished upon them. In their mute yet exact response was some compensation for external neglect. They were, so to say, the testimony of a good conscience, the assurance of professional merit, and of work well done, if scantily recognized. Poor and beloved sails and spars, la joie de la manoeuvre, to use the sympathetic phrase of a French officer of that day, gone ye are with the past of which I have been speaking, and of which ye were a goodly symbol. But, like other symptoms of the times, had we listened aright, we should have heard the stern rebuke, "Up and depart hence. This is not the place of your rest." The result of all this had been a body of officers and of men of war seamen strong in professional sentiment, and admirably qualified in the main for the duties of a calling which in many of its leading characteristics was rapidly becoming obsolete. There was the spirit of youth, but the body of age. As a class, officers and men were well up in the use of such instruments as the country gave them, but the profession did not wield the corporate influence necessary to extort better instruments. An impotence to remedy produced acquiescence in, perhaps more properly submission to, an arrest of progress, the evils of which were clearly seen. Yet the salt was still there, nor had it lost its savor. The military professions are discouraged, even enjoined, against that combined independent action for the remedy of grievances which is the safeguard of civil liberty, but tends to sap the unquestioning obedience essential to unity of action under a single will, at once the virtue and the menace of a standing army. Naval officers had neither the privilege nor the habits which would promote united effort for betterment; but when individuals among them are found, like Farragut, Dupont, Porter, Dahlgren, to mention only a few names that became conspicuous in the War of Secession, there will be found also in civil and political life men who will become the channels through which the needs of the service will receive expression and ultimately obtain relief. The process is over slow for perfect adequacy, but it exists. It may be asked, was not the Navy Department constituted for this special purpose? Possibly, but experience has shown that sometimes it is effective and sometimes it is not. There is in it no provision for a continuous policy. No administrative period of our naval history since 1812 has been more disastrously stagnant and inefficient than that which followed closely the War of Secession, with its extraordinary and in the main well directed administrative energy. The deeds of Farragut, his compeers, and their followers, after exciting a moment's enthusiasm, were powerless to sustain popular interest. Reaction ruled, as after the War of 1812. To whomsoever due, in the decade immediately preceding the War of Secession, there were two notable attempts at regeneration which had a profound influence upon the fortunes of that contest. Of these, one affected the personnel of the Navy, the other the material. It had for some time been recognized within the service that, owing partly to easygoing toleration of offenders, partly to the absence of authorized methods for dealing with the disabled, or the merely incompetent, partly also, doubtless, to the effect of general professional stagnation upon those naturally inclined to worthlessness, there had accumulated a very considerable percentage of officers who were useless, or worse, unreliable. In measure, this was also due to habits of drinking, much more common in all classes of men then than now. Yet within the 10 years with which I am dealing, an officer not much my senior remarked to me on the great improvement in this respect in his own experience, and my contemporaries will bear me out in saying that since then the advance has been so sustained that the evil now is practically non-existent. But then the compassionate expression, "a first-rate officer when he is not drinking," was ominously frequent, and in the generation before too little attention had been paid to the equally significant remark that with a fool you know what to count on, but with one who drank you never knew. But drink was far from the only cause. There were regular examinations after 6 years of service for promotion from the warrant of midshipman to a lieutenant's commission; but that successfully passed, there was no further review of an officer's qualifications, unless misconduct brought him before a court martial. Nor was there any provision for removing the physically incompetent. Before I entered the Navy I knew one such, who had been bedridden for nearly 10 years. He had been a midshipman with Farragut under Porter in the old Essex, when captured by the Phoebe and Cherub, a gallant boy, specially named in the dispatch. He had such aptitude that at 16, as he told me himself, he wore an epaulette on the left shoulder, the uniform of a lieutenant at that time, and a contemporary assured me that in handling a ship he was the smartest officer of the deck he had ever known. But in early middle life disease overtook him, and though flat on his back, he had been borne on the active list because there was nothing else to do with him. In that plight he was even promoted. There was another who, as a midshipman, had lost a foot in the War of 1812, but had been carried on from grade to grade for 40 years, until at the time I speak of he was a captain, then the highest rank in the Navy. Possibly, probably, he never saw water bluer than that of the lakes where he was wounded. The undeserving were not treated with quite the same indulgence. Those familiar with the Navy Register of those days will recall some half-dozen old diehards who figured from year to year at the head of the lieutenant's list. continuously overslawed, never promoted, but never dismissed. To deal in the same manner with such men as the two veterans first mentioned would have been insulting. The distinction of promotion had to be conceded. But there were those also who, despite habits or inefficiency, slipped through even formal examination; commanders whose ships were run by the subordinates, lieutenants whose watch on deck kept their captains from sleeping, midshipmen whose unfitness made their retention unpardonable; for at their age to rebegin life was no hardship, much less injustice. On one such the story ran that his captain, giving him the letter required by regulation, wrote, "Mr. So and so is a very excellent young gentleman of perfectly correct habits, but nothing will make an officer of him." He answered his questions, however, and the board considered that they could not go beyond that fact. They passed him in the face of the opinion of a superior of tried efficiency, who had had his professional conduct under prolonged observation. I never knew this particular man professionally, but the general estimate of the service confirmed his captain's opinion. 20 or 30 years later, I was myself one of a board called to deal with a precisely similar case. The letter of the captain was explicitly condemnatory and strong, but the president of the board, a man of exemplary rectitude, was vehement even in refusing to act upon it, and his opinion prevailed. Some years afterward the individual came under my command, and proved to be of so eccentric worthlessness that I thought him on the border line of insanity. He afterwards disappeared. I do not know how. End of chapter 1, part 1. Chapter 1 of From Sail to Steam by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Naval Conditions before the War of Secession. The Officers and Seamen. Part 1.